Welcome to Peculiar Tales. I'm your host, KMS. We're starting out the series with a story in my collection that centers around a rather unassuming, normal, everyday sight. But I assure you, it's peculiar indeed. Glass bottles, empty and cast aside after a night of merriment, left behind in an alleyway. They're not something we pay much attention to once empty. Have you ever found an empty glass bottle sitting somewhere in the streets and paid it enough mind to wonder how it got there, where it came from? Most likely not. And here's why you should keep it that way. This is the Bottle Troll. I had just returned home from a long day at the office. It was the middle of the night, my usual arrival time home during the week. It was nearing spring, but the nights were still around freezing. This night was particularly cold due to a mixture of gusting winds and a dampness in the air. I shuddered as I exited my vehicle and zipped up my coat, looking out at my so-called front yard of my apartment building, a mixture between an abandoned parking lot and an alley, complete with rusting, overgrown, and long-forgotten vehicles, and two rank, overflowing dumpsters. To put things simply, I was paying way too much for a hovel of an apartment in the slums of downtown. Anyways, it wasn't unusual to see an overabundance of trash in the alley, from food waste to cans, bags, boxes, even the occasional mattress or water heater. But this night was a bit more unusual. My tiny apartment resided up a set of rickety, dilapidated, and rotting stairs, hunkered up against the back of a crumbling brick building from the early 20th or late 19th century. Next to the opening of this stairway was a sharp, inward-facing 90-degree angle, where my building connected to another. The way the wind blew into the lot created a sort of whirlwind, spinning trash, debris, dust, and dirt into this corner, creating a heaping pile of junk. So I was expecting to see the usual pile of trash which resided there, but instead it was cleaned out. Plenty of dirt still lay there, but it was brushed outward into a flat surface. Atop this were, I would say, around 15 brown glass bottles, set up in perfect, neat rows, starting with one bottle in the corner and increasing by one outwards as the space between the two walls allowed the rows to lengthen. Seeing beer bottles in the corner of an alley was not unusual at all, though. My first thought was that a miscreant, or multiple miscreants, probably went back there to have a bit of fun, tucked away from prying eyes. The unusual part was how they were so neatly set up. None broken, none knocked over or out of place in their perfectly spaced out pattern. Even that would be something I would usually shrug off, especially in the exhausted state I was in. Yet there was an unease resting deep inside of me which stirred uncomfortably, causing my hackles to rise. I shuddered as goosebumps covered my body. Something was not right. I decided it best to try to ignore and forget about that feeling and those bottles, and head up to my apartment for some much-needed winding down before even more necessary sleep. I fell asleep fairly soon after lying down in bed and putting on a YouTube video to watch. The overhead light still on, but not a bother to my exhausted self. Usually I would eventually awaken from the bright glare of the light, stumble to the switch to turn it off, and fall back into bed. But when I woke up, I immediately realized that something else had stirred me from my sleep. After a moment of hazy half-sleep, I rose up to a sitting position, a faint clicking sound ringing in my ears. It was a repetitive clink, 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 not stopping. It sounded like it was right outside of my window. I lifted the blankets off of my lower half and was about to get up to investigate when I remembered the bottles in the corner. That same unsettling sensation, that deep, underlying fear, came over me again. I froze, my feet hanging off of the bed, the clinking suddenly seeming a much more disturbing sound. Then it began to move, getting louder as it neared my front door. A lack of insulation and poor construction, which left behind minor cracks and openings where the cold night air and the clinking seeped in. Amongst the clacks came a gravelly, squeaky, high-pitched laugh, and then the quick tapping of feet as they made their way down the stairs in a rush. The tapping was more of a slap than a clunk, as if the feet were shoeless. Lastly, there was a quick clinking, clanking, and clattering of what sounded like multiple bottles that was then followed by complete and utter silence. I sat there for quite some time, the clinking and unnatural laugh repeating over and over again in my head. A part of me wanted to investigate, to go down into the cold blackness and see what happened to those bottles. Every other part of me told me to stay inside, and I listened. After what seemed like hours of tossing and turning, thinking about what happened, I fell asleep. I awoke the next morning to my alarm as usual, and upon opening the curtain on my single window for the entire apartment, I was greeted with bright and intense rays of sunlight. The day was deceiving, though. The air was still cool and the apartment cooler. I turned on the heater and went about my daily ritual of breakfast and coffee before cleaning up the kitchen. After finishing my chores in the kitchen, I quickly threw on my coat and some shoes, still in a distant state of mind, not yet fully awake because of my fitful rest. My mind was so distant from the outside world that I passed by the dreaded corner of the two buildings without a second thought. After throwing out the bag of trash, or rather setting it atop the heaping pile of other refuse in the dumpster, I turned around and headed for the dilapidated staircase, only to freeze up as my eyes fell upon the shadowed, dirt-filled corner, distinctly empty of any bottles. Not even a trace of them left. No broken glass, no bottle caps, not even an indent in the dirt. I turned around and headed back to the dumpster. Perhaps the drunk, or drunks, returned to clean up their mess, or a good Samaritan decided to clean up. Yet, there were no loose bottles or bag of bottles atop the heaping pile of trash. Obviously, the bottles would not be buried as the same mound existed the night before. So, just where did those bottles go? Did someone decide to recycle them? It still all seems strange, but I went about my day and mostly forgot about the events while at work. I returned home to a similarly cool night, but this time lacking the wind, totally still and silent. I let out an instinctive gasp and nearly jumped as I approached the dark corner by the staircase. The brown bottles had returned, all neatly set up in rows, the same pattern as the previous night, all set up straight. I got inside quickly rather than sit there and ponder, the sense of dread and unease once again overtaking me. I had a hard time falling asleep that night, dreading a repeat of the previous one. Once I did fall asleep, I soon discovered that my fears were justified. My eyes shot open at the familiar but haunting, unsettling clink, clink, clink of the bottles outside of my window, and then the muffled squeaking, chattering laugh. Even though my entire being told me no, I decided to approach the window. The curtain was drawn, blocking the view. I reached out to pull a corner of it away as adrenaline coursed through me, but paused right before grasping it in my hand. I listened intently to a bated breathing, raspy and crackling, coming from directly outside of the window. Then came a series of sniffs, a pause, and a voice.
I know you're in there. I can smell you. Smell fear, anticipation. Do you want to see my collection?
asked a voice in the same raspy, squeaking noise as the laugh.
I saw you peeking. Come admire it. Tell me you like it.
Then there was a quick patter of shoeless feet and the rattle of the locked door handle.
Don't be shy.
Then another laugh. The adrenaline I had lost before returned in full, and I screamed, yelling at him, whatever it was, to get away. The laugh returned and it spoke through the cracks of the door.
Fine, but I'll be back. I know you want to see.
Then there was the smacking retreat of feet down the stairs, the clattering of bottles, and silence, just as the previous night. After a moment, I unlocked the door and quickly rushed out onto the deck outside. There was no trace of anyone or anything, just a cold, still night. I peered down the stairs to the corner and squinted in an attempt to see through the shadowed darkness. The bottles were no longer there. That night was another practically sleepless one, but after it, everything seemed to calm down and return to normal. I came home to no bottles the next night, and this continued until I was nearly able to push those two disturbing events from my head, or at least consider them some kind of dream or hallucination until I could. But everything came rushing back when I returned home from a series of errands during my day off. Sometime in the early evening, a warm orange glow blanketing everything, a hint of spring and budding life in the air. With grocery bags in hand, I waddled awkwardly up the steps to my door. Those bags dropped to the deck as I approached it and saw what lay in front of me. Before the door was a row of brown bottles, set up straight and perfectly spaced out. A now familiar rush of adrenaline overcame me, and mixed with a number of other emotions, fear, anger, dread. This explosion of feelings ended with me kicking the bottles away, breaking some in the process, and then picking up and smashing the rest against the deck. I stepped inside, leaving the mess there. I immediately regretted the outburst, knowing that destroying those bottles would most likely come back to haunt me that night. Another side of me kept saying that this was all a wild imagining in my head, a series of coincidences and bad dreams, but the mounting evidence was persuading me otherwise. So I sat there in the apartment for much of the rest of the evening, not doing anything, not able to do much, because of the worry tormenting my mind. As the night crept in and my apartment grew dark, suspense, dread, and anticipation of what was to come built, while I waited for the return of whatever it was that was out there. I was expecting the now familiar, but still completely unsettling clink, clink, clink of two bottles, but jumped instead at the sound of a loud thunk against my door and the shattering of glass. One after the other, bottles shattered against the door, and that horrid laugh returned. And another volley of bottles, then silence.
I just wanted to share my collection with you, for you to admire it. Such a curious one it seemed. But now you go and ruin it, destroy my bottles? Well, now the rest is pointless. I must start over, and you will pay. How about you come out and see my collection now? Ruined because of you, no more hiding.
I yelled at it to leave, threatened to call the police, threatened to attack it, but it just laughed even more.
Come out wherever you are. I can still smell you,
it said as it rattled the door.
You're no fun. Guess we'll have to do this the hard way.
I could hear it stepping away from the door and towards the window. I approached it as well, the curtain once again drawn. But this time, I was ready to pull it back, to see this thing for what it truly was. I ripped away the curtain, and the glow of my overhead light poured out into the night, illuminating its face. It was pale and rat-like, the hair covering its head and face long, matted, in a sickly brown. It was hunched forward so far that its long, wiry arms dangled in front of it. It grinned, showing yellowed, rotting buck teeth, before taking the broken neck of a bottle and using it to smash right through the window. Before I could react, its hand with bony fingers, tipped with long, twisted, filthy, claw-like nails, came through the opening and latched onto my shirt, pulling me forward. As I was pulled up against the window, I was immediately overcome with the miasma surrounding it, an overwhelming stench of old stale alcohol and trash. The smell alone, mixed with the horror of seeing such a sight before me, caused me to black out. But before I did, a final rush of adrenaline kicked in, and I forced both of my hands through the window, causing the whole thing to shatter and grasp my hands around its neck. That's the last thing I remember. I awoke lying on the floor, surrounded by shattered glass, looking up at my neighbor who had awoken to all the noise and come to investigate, and upon seeing me lying on the floor, crawled in through the broken window to make sure I was alright. I was, beyond a few cuts and bruises on my hands, a few pieces of glass in my back, and the everlasting mental trauma that those nights caused me. Needless to say, I didn't stay in that slum much longer, leaving as soon as I could, even before I had made plans of another place to go. As for whatever that thing was, where it came from, and where it went, I still don't know. The police were called to the scene that night, and I described it as a disfigured homeless man, not wanting to sound too mad, but ended up sounding so when I recalled the bottles being thrown at my door. The police found no trace of bottles either shattered or intact, only the glass from the window, shards both inside the apartment and on the deck. My neighbor did back up my claims, saying that the shattering of bottles was heard, but the police seemed to ignore that fact without evidence. I just hope I never see it again. Even now that I'm far, far away from that place, I dread it, dream nightmares of it, of that rat face, those claws, that disgusting grin and smell, that laugh, but most of all, that clink, clink, clink of two bottles being hit together. That was the Bottle Troll, and this is Peculiar Tales. I hope you enjoyed the story. If you did, please consider hitting the subscribe button below, leaving a like, a comment, and lastly, clicking the bell to be notified when the next peculiar tale in my collection is released. Lastly, if you'd like to download this tale and others, click the Bandcamp link in the description below. It's free to download, but donations are greatly appreciated. You can also donate directly to the podcast through the PayPal link, also found in the description below. Thank you for joining me. I hope to see you next time.